What began as a conflict over the transfer of consciousness from flesh to machines escalated into a war which has decimated 1,000,000 worlds. The core and the arm have all but exhausted the resources of a galaxy in their struggle for domination. Both sides now crippled beyond repair, the remnants of their armies continue to battle on ravaged planets, their hatred fueled by over 4,000 years of total war. This is a fight to the death. For each side, the only acceptable outcome is the complete elimination of the other.
Awesome narrator, check. Good music, check. Good gameplay, we'll get to that part. Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I, as a younger gamer, go back to old but classic games I have played little if any of to see if they hold up under a modern lens. In this video, I take a look at the progenitor to my favorite RTS growing up, and one of the most unique RTS of its time, Total Annihilation. When Total Annihilation was released, you had a lot of competition, with the likes of Command & Conquer Red Alert as well as the Warcraft series proving to everyone what the real-time strategy genre can do. In order to stand out and be successful, whoever developed a new RTS would have to either diverge dramatically, or be really good at besting two of the RTS giants of the day. Chris Taylor and his team at Cave Dog Studios decided to move in the former direction, preferring to take a more innovative approach to stand out. To start off, it was the first RTS to use full 3D models. You've no doubt seen some cutscenes as to how ugly people often looked with basic 3D graphics, but by choosing a futuristic setting overtaken by sentient robots, they were able to get around the issue of how blocky 3D graphics were, and how expensive full-motion video could be as well. Who cares if they have a Spartan design? It's an army of giant robots! Where the game set itself apart, though, was in the way the economy was built. Traditionally in an RTS, you have to gather limited resources across the map, and then you select what you would like to build with those resources being taken away when you start building. However, in Total Annihilation, the game took a much different turn. Instead of having limited resources that would eventually disappear, your resources were only limited by the number of buildings and locations you have to exploit them. You can still send workers to reclaim destroyed buildings and units, as well as destroyed trees and rocks to gather more resources, but these run out rather quickly, forcing you to rely on your consistent income. Instead of getting a flat amount gathered from a worker, buildings were used to gather the main resources, metal and energy, and along with being infinite, the economy used something called streaming, where both your production and collection over time affected your total reserves. This allows you to string a bunch of build orders or unit production together without technically having the resources for it, at the expense of slowing down all of your production if you go over budget on either metal or energy. Metal is harder to acquire and essential to most construction, and energy can be the most plentiful but is also used to keep structures operational, such as powering metal production and radar towers, firing artillery, and so on. These changes in the economy were pervasive throughout the game itself, causing more of a focus on macro management, controlling larger armies, over micromanagement, the movement of individual units. To further reinforce this idea, instead of upgrading specific units to become more powerful, you start out with basic units and can choose whether to flood your enemy with these weaker units, or to invest in advanced units which are more powerful but take more time to construct. Units still follow the traditional land, air, and naval arrangement, but the fundamental feel of the game is what made it stand out to many. And even to this day, many still play this game and its spiritual successor, Supreme Commander, which is the game that even now can shoot through a good number of low-end to mid-range PCs with how much stuff can be put on the screen at once. Even today it holds some relevance, as games mimicking this style of RTS have been few and far between, and frankly, you don't even see that many RTS anymore. We're here to discuss the progenitor of what I understand to be the large-scale RTS, and when placed under a modern lens, does it still hold up? Let's start with the gameplay, since we've already gone over what the big difference is from most RTS, and the game is primarily focused around said gameplay. I've already talked about the basics of what the economy and unit construction is about, so let's focus on the execution. The way that it worked wasn't quite what I expected, but I still found it interesting in its own right. At the start of most games, you are given a commander, a powerful walker and fighter who is the heart and backbone of your army. This unit is where much of the hidden complexity of the economy comes into greater focus, as he can construct buildings incredibly quickly so long as he has the resources, but at the risk of draining your reserves just as quickly. Every factory can create a different kind of construction unit, which allows you to gain different advanced units later on, and have different strengths and weaknesses in their own right. The air constructor is the least susceptible to getting boxed in by its own construction, given that it can fly, and is more mobile, but is more vulnerable to aircraft and doesn't build as quickly as land-based constructors. The naval constructor has access to primarily sea buildings, such as torpedo launchers, sonar stations, and a variety of water-based resource gathering structures. Each of these constructors are also required to build advanced units, as they can only build the advanced factories for their type of unit. The land units are where this game differentiates from what you might expect. Rather than having one factory devoted to land units, there are two of them, one for robotic walkers, called K-bots, and the other for tanks. Once that you reach the core contingency, one of two expansions added into the game with the GOG version, you also get a third type, hovercraft, which acts as another type of advanced unit and can traverse over difficult terrain. This might not seem like a big deal, but it creates an interesting strategic decision from the outset. Go for walkers, which aren't as mobile and tend to have more interesting unit diversity later in, or for tanks, which aren't as mobile but which can take and deal more of a beating. Once that you get into the advanced units with the default 2, you start to see them diverge a fair amount. For instance, the advanced vehicle plant gives you a lot of durable tanks, while the walkers get some very interesting ideas, with both factions getting different kinds of short-range and long-range K-bots to play around with, which have wide-reaching effects on later game strategies. The unit diversity overall is really good, and there is a lot of hidden strategy and rock paper scissors going on. Each unit has their strengths and weaknesses, and there aren't any units that feel useless or pointless. The main campaign for both the core and the ARM starts out the same way. The two factions have been embroiled in a centuries-long conflict, and you start the story with the faction of your choice on the brink of defeat. While controlling the only remaining commander for your faction, you must push back against your opponent and, as the game's title suggests, completely annihilate them. The first few missions start out in fairly the same manner, and serve as a basic tutorial for figuring out how the game works. After you have pushed the enemy off of your homeworld and followed them into a galactic gate towards another planet, the missions begin to diverge as you take different approaches for pushing back the other faction and trying to finally end this war. There are also two expansions that come with the GOG version. The first one, the core contingency, takes place after the war between the two factions has ended, with the assumption that the ARM won. However, the core had a contingency plan in case the ARM ever succeeded, where they would have a commander emerge from hiding and take control of this alien device which could trigger the galaxy to implode and rebuild itself. All but the device itself and the lone commander inside it would survive, allowing him to rebuild the galaxy anew. The second expansion, Battle Tactics, gives you a huge number of scenarios, leaving you a basic objective and a set number of units to complete it. These range from navigating your commander through enemy territory, to defending an objective, to shaking off an enemy attack, to much more. There are so many of these scenarios that I wasn't able to try all of them, but what I did check out showed a huge variety of missions that require you to be good at different aspects of the game. If you pick this up, Battle Tactics is what will make it worth it to you. Each planet has their own little aspect that changes your strategy. Lava and cliff faces make it impossible for land units to pass, encouraging you to use aircraft. Different planets are made up of different soil, which hold different implications for resource gathering. Empyreon, the homeworld of the ARM, is a planet similar to Earth that requires you to put metal extractors onto specific metal deposits. Core Prime, the homeworld of the core, is made entirely of metal, which means metal extractors can be built pretty much anywhere and have maximum efficiency. While on other planets the size of the metal deposit can mean one metal extractor collects more resources over time than another, on Core Prime all of them collect a boatload, meaning you can mass produce units much more quickly. You also gain access to different technology as the game progresses, and even though you visit the same planets in both campaigns, the scenarios themselves are fairly different. However, the main campaign feels drawn out. When I saw there were going to be 50 missions in total and a bunch more for the two expansions, I thought that would be awesome. In fact, it would have been if there was more variety. Sure, there are some interesting ideas, such as a mission where you're forced to turtle, missions where your commander is on its own, and so on, but often it seems like a lot of the mission diversity is superimposed on us. Instead of relying solely on giving us more options, sometimes they take the cheaper path by removing some of our options, bottlenecking us into taking a certain strategy. So let me get this straight. You want me to rely on these bombers who can't hit anything on a raised plateau to deal with their few air defenses, which gunships would have no trouble dealing with, which I can't build because you won't let me build air constructors, so that I can sneak a commander past their ground units to capture something. Instead of letting me figure out an organic solution to this and naturally figure out the right decision, you're forcing me into one particular direction on the off chance that I would try a land-based approach. It's a nitpick, but it feels like an unnecessary restriction. Frankly, I feel they could have easily taken away one or two of the planets that you visit in each campaign, and then used that shorter game length to do some more interesting stuff. Though there are some unique missions and different aspects to each map, for most missions I was able to use the same strategy over and over. Turtle until one has giant army. Throw giant army at enemy. Throw second army that you were building up at enemy as your first one is repelled. Rinse and repeat. Even though I was on hard mode for much of the main campaign, it was far too easy to use this strategy because the enemy doesn't understand how to effectively manage their own economy. As long as you can get your own economy established, you will always outlast them. Fortunately, the core contingency is a little better in this regard, and battle tactics is a lot better. The core contingency suffers from some of the same problems, but because it's much shorter, it doesn't feel nearly as drawn out. It's also more challenging, forcing me to go back to medium difficulty for all of it. Battle Tactics contains the mission variety that I expected with the campaigns, even if you aren't spending all of your time with the commander. For much of the game though, it feels far too easy, especially after you figure out just how powerful your commander can be. If you have enough energy reserves, the commander can expend some of that energy to use the D-gun. And no, I'm not making up that name, it says so right here. This gun will literally one-shot any non-submerged naval unit or land unit in range. It doesn't need scrap metal, but once that you learn it exists, not even advanced land units pose much of a challenge for you when they can be instantly pulverized. The power of the D compels thee! Granted, the commander is still susceptible to air units, and if the commander is destroyed at any point, then the game is over. But this gets into my biggest issue with the campaign itself: difficulty spikes. Most of the challenge in the campaigns were a result of difficulty spikes, which were inconsistent and absolutely frustrating. Fortunately, you can skip missions that are giving you trouble, as you can select pretty much any mission at any time. But I shouldn't have to skip over sections just to handle your poor difficulty management. Perhaps the worst place where this happens was on a planet where there were periodic meteor showers, throwing in a ridiculous amount of RNG into any mission on that planet. To be fair, the RNG worked both ways. In one attempt to capture the galactic gate for that planet, I had my starting army destroyed and had to restart. In another, the enemy's fusion reactor was destroyed, which meant they couldn't power their nasty artillery, which could have easily one-shot my commander. I understand that meteor showers can be cool, but realism shouldn't get in the way of good gameplay. And while I can accept randomness in a card game where luck has a clear part to play, it's frankly unacceptable in a real-time strategy game, at least to this degree. What's ironic about the difficulty spikes is because they were a result of good AI. The AI in the campaign doesn't understand how to effectively use their economy, which makes it easier to outlast them, but when they actually have units on the field, they are ruthless. The AI knows exactly what will hurt most, targeting your radar to block out vision, then anything shooting back at them, and from there just completely tearing you apart. However, this meant that whenever the enemy got a pack of gunships early on, unless the meteor shower RNG was in your favor, you were dead, because you don't get good air defenses until the core contingency, and even then, it's an advanced structure that takes a long time to build. Sadly, those aren't my only issues, because when it comes to actual control and usability, Total Annihilation is flat out bad. The units themselves are extremely finicky to control. To provide variety and strategic options for the maps, the terrain isn't a flat surface, but has plateaus, mountains, impassable areas, and all that fun stuff that we need to worry about. This isn't a problem in and of itself, but the game's logic treats it all as a flat surface. This is a nifty trick to improve performance, but it also means whenever you have something on a raised hill, long-range units and bombers have a much harder time hitting it because they end up hitting the terrain directly in front of or below it. On top of that, land units don't properly understand what it means to go up a hill, maintain a formation, or move past trees and wreckage. Even without something in the way, the pathing on land units is terrible, as they think it's a smart idea to run into each other, mill about trying to get past each other, all the while getting nailed by enemy fire. You are an army of giant robots! Why the hell is this such a problem? Don't even get me started on the unit pathing for naval units. It is ugly. The main reason for the difficulty at the start of the core contingency is because of stupid naval unit pathing. Well, that and torpedo bombers. Those things are evil. The interface itself definitely doesn't do it any favors. Granted, this was a game made back when monitors still came in 6400 by 480, which meant that the UI had to be collapsible, much like what you see in mobile games today. However, when one is trying to release this on GOG, there's no reason why you couldn't expand or unpack some of the UI options given how much empty space you have, especially when it comes to construction. I can respect micromanagement, but when it means having to flip through 3 or 4 tabs just to find the right building and then have to flip into a separate menu just to make sure I know you're going to move properly, that becomes a problem. Don't even get me started on how limited hotkey customization is. I shouldn't have to go online just to find out what combination of buttons will allow me to simply group units. Tooltips also tend to be generally unhelpful, as they can tell you how much a building costs, but doesn't explain very well what a certain building does, how long it will take to be created until it's already built, or how quickly resources will be depleted for the unit you're using to construct it. How much buildings increase storage for metal and energy, allowing you to go over budget for a short time, is also completely absent, because apparently that's simply not important enough to warrant letting us know. The tooltips for units in general aren't very good either, as when they're on the field you have to judge based on their names rather than what they're designated as. You figure out the gist of everything after a while, but it's hard to justify such a poor UI in this day and age. Pretty much through the whole game, I found myself either frustrated with unit pathing and archaic UI, annoyed by the difficulty spikes, or bored by how easy the rest of it was. Even though I have a healthy respect for the game, I just found it so difficult to finish. The concept is great, but it's so hard to look past how dated everything feels. This is a game about macro management because of the economy, but just to get a decent formation, I have to manage every little movement of my units. Come on guys, that's not what makes a good RTS. Fortunately, even if it doesn't control spectacularly, it does run really well. Getting it to record properly was tedious, which meant that I didn't do a live playthrough, but when I wasn't recording, it ran at a solid 60 frames per second the whole time, even while I was rendering video. The menus are still locked at 6400 by 480 for some reason, but while in game, it does actually scale to 1080p. But be aware that for some reason the game sometimes discolored itself, which I'm pretty sure was because of disagreements with other software or issues with alt-tabbing. I've been harping on gameplay for a while, so before I wrap up, let's take a look at the presentation of the game. You've already heard the narrator talk about the story itself, so let's start with that narrator. He is awesome. Hearing him at the beginning of all of the main campaign and core contingency missions was really nice. The story might seem like a dumb plot to serve as an excuse for gameplay, and to some extent, you're right. You're just controlling these two factions of robots on their everlasting quest to beat the crap out of each other. Still, by doing this, they were able to take away much of the overhead complexity or campiness that other RTS campaigns fall prey to. Just go look up some of the full motion video for Command & Conquer and you'll instantly know what I mean. Frankly though, I'm kind of glad they went this route, as at least this game, unlike Supreme Commander, was sensible enough to know that this really is about you controlling an army of giant robots against an opposing army of giant robots, and just left it at that. There's nothing inherently wrong with having a simple story as long as the gameplay holds it up, which in modern day is debatable, but I've already got enough people mad at me for that. Besides, all that we need to know about the story is carried to us by the best dramatic narrator ever that I don't care how lifeless it actually is. However, after the mission briefings, it seems like the game loses some of that epic feel. You can go into the options menu while in game to see what your objective is, but it can be easy to forget the whole point of your venture into the game until after you destroy something you were supposed to capture, or eventually find that one last little unit hiding in an inconspicuous corner of the map. To the game's credit, the music does a good job at giving this sense of an epic struggle even if it doesn't always feel that way. You could substitute some of the music in Star Wars for this and I wouldn't bat an eyelash. Which is kind of fitting considering the composer went on to do music for Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic and The Elder Scrolls. I'd say that's a major change, but given the style of music here, I think it's rather fitting. As for the graphics and aesthetic, they're serviceable. The army of giant robots doesn't feel as epic given how small they look on the field, but given how many units you can put out, that's probably for the best. The factions aren't all that different from each other, although perhaps you could read that into something about the futility of their struggle. But they do have their visual and gameplay differences that help you clue in on which is which. Overall, I can definitely understand why people love this game. The idea of running around with an army of giant robots is great. The economy is radically different from most RTS nowadays, and had I been born 10 years earlier, I could see myself legitimately enjoying it at release. However, in this day and age, I have a hard time recommending it to anyone who hasn't already played it. I know a lot of people will yell at me for being hard on this game, when you might be able to find people in multiplayer. Based on what I know about the game, that's where it really shined. However, I find that argument to be rather flimsy when most people who are still playing the game for multiplayer have gotten really good at it. So there's almost no way that you can find a fair match nowadays. Which means that the single player content is all that new players have to latch onto. And if the missions and scenarios aren't very good, then what is there for someone new to fixate on? Sure, we don't see very many good RTS nowadays, but the interface, usability, difficulty spikes, and a laundry list of other nitpicks makes it really hard to recommend. I think what will put most people over the edge here is just how cheap the game is. $6 on GOG is a good price for an artifact of gaming history, and especially in an age where there aren't very many real-time strategy games anymore, there is some reason to return. It's a shame though. I went into this game hoping to like it, but I didn't enjoy it nearly as much as I expected. It did get me to play through Supreme Commander again at least, just to see what's changed through the years. Frankly, if you're looking for a large-scale RTS nowadays, you're probably better off with Supreme Commander and its expansion Forged Alliance, as it still has the poor unit pathing, but at least you get 3 tiers of units, giant experimental units above that, and it's easier to make the argument for a multiplayer community. That's all I have for this video. Thank you all for watching. If for some reason you find my verbal lashing of this game deserving, consider liking and sharing this video, and keep an eye on this channel for the next game in Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a not-so-regular basis. In the meantime, let's get some Total Annihilation music stuck in your head.